What if I told you that the most beloved Targaryen king in Westeros history took the exact opposite journey from the most controversial Targaryen queen? While Daenerys Targaryen descended from liberator to tyrant, her great-great-grandfather Aegon the Fifth, better known as Egg, ascended from common boy to compassionate king. These two characters represent mirror images of the same fundamental question: what happens when a Targaryen with good intentions tries to change the world? With HBO's upcoming series, A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, bringing Egg's story to our screens, now is the perfect time to explore how his arc directly contrasts with Daenerys' tragic trajectory. Both started with noble ideals and dreams of helping the oppressed. Both possessed dragons or desperately sought them. Both faced resistance from the established nobility. Yet one journey led to redemption and the other to destruction. Let's dive into why Egg's path represents everything Daenerys could have been, if only she had walked in his footsteps. Starting from completely opposite positions in the world defines everything about these two characters. Daenerys began her journey as arguably the most powerless person in Westeros. Born during a storm on Dragonstone while her mother fled Robert's rebellion, she spent her childhood as an exile, a beggar princess with no home, no army, and no dragons. Her brother Viserys abused her, sold her to Khal Drogo like property, and she had absolutely no agency in her own life. She was timid, obedient, constantly afraid, and had known nothing but fear and servitude. Every single thing Daenerys gained in her journey, she had to fight for, claw for, and often burn for. Egg, on the other hand, was born Prince Aegon Targaryen, fourth son of Prince Maekar, who himself was the son of King Daeron II. He lived in the royal palace at Summerhall, served as a page at the Red Keep, and attended small council meetings. He had the finest education, the best food, and every privilege that came with being a prince of the blood. Yet, here's the crucial difference. Egg voluntarily gave it all up. When his brother Daeron disappointed their father by getting drunk instead of competing at the Ashford tourney, Daeron shaved Egg's head to hide his distinctive Targaryen silver-gold hair. Rather than wait for his family to retrieve him, young Egg made a choice that would define his entire life. He approached a hedge knight named Duncan and asked to be his squire, calling himself simply Egg and hiding his royal identity. This difference in starting position fundamentally shapes their worldviews. Daenerys climbed from absolute powerlessness to ultimate power. She learned that the world respects only strength, that mercy is weakness, and that those without power are crushed beneath the wheels of those who have it. Every betrayal she suffered, from Mirri Maz Duur to the warlocks of Qarth to the slavers of Meereen, reinforced this brutal lesson. Power became not just a tool for her, but an identity, a validation of her worth, and proof that she would never be that frightened girl sold to the Dothraki again. Egg's journey moved in the opposite direction. He descended from privilege to see the world as the small folk saw it. He experienced hunger, fear, and injustice not as abstract concepts discussed in council chambers, but as lived reality. When a noble brutalized a puppeteer named Tencel Tootal at Ashford, Egg didn't just hear about peasant suffering, he witnessed it and felt powerless to stop it. When he traveled through the drought-stricken Reach during the Sworn Sword, he saw how the feudal system failed ordinary people, how lords squabbled over streams while small folk starved. These weren't lessons from books or advisors, they were experiences that shaped his soul. He learned that power without compassion is tyranny, and that those born to rule have an obligation to those they govern. The mentor figures in their lives shaped them in fundamentally different ways. Daenerys' early influences taught her contradictory and often destructive lessons. Viserys filled her head with dreams of conquest and reclaiming what was stolen from their family, but he also beat her and reminded her she was nothing without his permission. Khal Drogo showed her a kind of love, but within a culture built on conquest and slavery. Even her Khalasar respected strength above all else. When Mirri Maz Duur betrayed her, Daenerys learned to trust no one completely. Her advisors in Essos, Jorah, Barristan Selmy, and later Tyrion often gave her conflicting counsel, and she learned to rely primarily on her own judgment and her dragons. The isolation of power became Daenerys' constant companion. As she rose higher, she had fewer true friends and more courtiers, fewer honest voices, and more people who feared her. By the time she reached Westeros, she had lost almost everyone who genuinely cared about her as a person rather than as a symbol. Jorah died at Winterfell. Missandei was executed by Cersei. 2 of her 3 dragons were killed. Jon Snow betrayed her secret. Tyrion made mistakes. Varys plotted against her. The loneliness of her position, surrounded by subjects but devoid of true companions, drove her toward increasingly extreme decisions. Egg's experience with mentorship couldn't have been more different. Sir Duncan the Tall became not just his knight, but his closest friend, his moral compass, and eventually his Lord Commander of the King's Guard. Duncan was a simple man, honest, brave, and fundamentally decent. He embodied the common sense morality of ordinary people. More importantly, Duncan treated Egg as an equal once his identity was revealed. He didn't grovel or treat him as a superior being. He continued to call him Egg, occasionally cuffed him when he got too proud, and reminded him through action what honor really meant. Duncan showed Egg that nobility has nothing to do with birth and everything to do with character. Throughout their travels across Westeros, Egg and Duncan encountered countless ordinary people, merchants in Dorne, farmers in the Reach, rebels in the Riverlands. The she-wolves of Winterfell. Each encounter taught Egg something about the real Westeros, not the version discussed in council chambers, but the version lived by millions who would never see a castle or meet a lord. He learned that small folk weren't faceless masses, but individuals with hopes, fears, families, and dreams. This education in humanity became the foundation of everything he would later try to accomplish as king. Perhaps most crucially, Duncan remained by Egg's side even after he became king. Aegon the Fifth had someone who remembered him as a bald boy sleeping in hedges, someone who would tell him the truth regardless of consequence, someone who loved him not for his crown, but for himself. This authentic relationship grounded Egg in a way Daenerys never experienced. By the time she reached King's Landing, everyone close to her was either dead or had betrayed her. She stood alone at the pinnacle of power with no one to remind her who she truly was. Their relationship with power itself reveals the fundamental opposition between their arcs. Daenerys craved power because she had been powerless for so long. She needed it to validate herself, to prove she was more than a frightened girl, to ensure no one could ever hurt her again. Her identity became inseparable from her titles: Daenerys Stormborn of House Targaryen, Queen of the Andals and the First Men, Protector of the Seven Kingdoms, Khaleesi of the Great Grass Sea, Breaker of Chains, Mother of Dragons. Each title represented a conquest, a victory over those who doubted her. When people challenged her claim or refused to bend the knee, she took it as a personal affront because her power defined her existence. The dragons amplified this relationship with power exponentially. They were living weapons, yes, but more than that, they were proof of her special destiny, validation that she was meant to rule. When Drogon killed a child in Meereen, she chained her dragons, showing some restraint. But as she lost advisors, as she faced betrayal and resistance, she increasingly relied on Dragonfire as the ultimate arbiter of justice. By the end, her dragons weren't tools of liberation, but instruments of domination. The very thing that made her special became the thing that destroyed her capacity for mercy. Egg's relationship with power developed along the opposite trajectory. He was born with power and chose to set it aside. During his years with Duncan, he could have revealed his identity at any moment to escape danger or gain advantage. Sometimes he did, as when he saved Duncan from execution after the Trial of Seven. But mostly, he kept his ring hidden in his boot and lived as a commoner. This taught him that power is a responsibility, not a right, and that those who wield it must understand those over whom they wield it. When Egg unexpectedly became king, many lords considered him unsuitable precisely because of his common experiences. They called him half a peasant and worried he had spent too much time among small folk to rule effectively. They weren't wrong to worry, but they misunderstood the nature of their concern. Egg hadn't been corrupted by common life, he had been educated by it. He understood that the feudal system ground millions of people beneath its weight, that lords held power not by divine right, but by historical accident, and that a good king must serve all his people, not just the nobility. Unlike Daenerys, who needed dragons to enforce her will, Aegon the Fifth specifically resisted using overwhelming force. He tried to build coalitions, arrange marriages for his children to great houses, sought compromise and consensus. Only at the very end of his reign, after years of frustration at how the nobility blocked his reforms, did he turn to dragons as a solution. And that decision killed him. The tragedy at Summerhall, where Egg died trying to hatch dragon eggs, represents the ultimate warning. Even good intentions backed by dragonfire lead to disaster. The nature of their reforms and their reception exposes another crucial difference. Daenerys' liberation campaign in Essos was immediate and dramatic. She freed the slaves of Astapor, Yunkai, and Meereen through overwhelming force. She crucified the masters who had crucified slave children. She burned the khals who threatened her. Her justice was swift, violent, and absolute. To those she freed, she was a goddess Misa mother. To those who opposed her, she was terror incarnate. There was no middle ground, no negotiation, no compromise. But here's what the show eventually revealed. Daenerys' revolution was unsustainable because it was built on personal power rather than systemic change. The moment she left Meereen, the city began to collapse back into its old patterns. She hadn't built institutions that could survive her absence. She hadn't educated people in self-governance. She hadn't created economic systems that could replace slavery. She had simply broken the old system through force and expected something better to emerge from the ruins. Aegon the Fifth took a completely different approach. His reforms focused on systemic changes, grants of rights and protections to small folk, legal reforms that limited noble privileges, interventions when lords like Tytos Lannister governed incompetently. We don't know the exact details of all his reforms because George R.R. Martin has been deliberately vague, but we know they focused on freedoms, rights, and protections to the small folk. These weren't dramatic gestures or violent purges. They were legal and administrative changes designed to limit the arbitrary power of nobles over commoners. The resistance Egg faced came not from a single enemy he could burn, but from the entire structure of Westerosi feudalism. The lords felt their powers were being diminished and curtailed. They pushed back, not with open rebellion, which Egg could have crushed with royal armies, but with passive resistance, legal challenges, and political maneuvering. Without dragons to force compliance, Egg had to compromise. He had to negotiate. He had to accept that change would be slower than he wanted and incomplete during his lifetime. This represents perhaps the most profound difference between them. Daenerys increasingly saw compromise as betrayal of her principles. When the slavers pushed back, she responded with crucifixions. When the khals dismissed her, she burned them alive. When Westeros didn't welcome her as a liberator, she took it as a personal rejection. Her response to resistance was always escalation. More fire, more blood, more destruction until everyone bent the knee or died. Egg accepted compromise as the price of lasting change. He understood that you cannot force people to be good, that sustainable reform requires buy-in from those affected, and that revolution without foundation crumbles the moment the revolutionary leaves. His willingness to compromise frustrated him deeply. We know from the text that he grew increasingly bitter about the limitations on his vision, that he felt his greatest hopes were receding further and further into the future. This frustration ultimately drove him to Summerhall and his attempt to hatch dragons. But for 26 years, he chose the slow path, the patient path, the path that built institutions rather than breaking them. The tragedy is that Egg's reforms didn't survive him. Within a generation, many were rolled back, particularly under Tywin Lannister's tenure as Hand to Aerys II. By the time of Game of Thrones, small folk have few protections and less hope. Egg's story seems like a failure on the surface, but consider this: he's remembered as Aegon the Fortunate by those he helped. The small folk loved him, and his attempts at reform, even if temporary, showed that another way was possible. he planted seeds that didn't take root in his time but might someday bloom. Daenerys' revolution, by contrast, was built for immediate impact but no lasting legacy. When she died, what remained? Ashes and trauma. The freed cities of Slaver's Bay likely fell back into old patterns. Westeros was devastated by Dragonfire. The wheel she promised to break instead crushed millions. Her legacy is destruction, not construction. Let's talk about the role of isolation and loss in their descents, because this is where their arcs truly mirror each other while moving in opposite directions. As Daenerys rose to power, she became increasingly alone. Every person who truly cared about her died or betrayed her. Her husband Drogo, dead. Her child, dead. Rhaegal and Viserion, dead. Jorah, dead. Missandei, executed. Jon Snow revealed her secret. Tyrion made fatal mistakes. Varys turned traitor. By the time she sat on Drogon above King's Landing, listening to the bells of surrender, she was utterly, completely alone. No one remained to remind her of her better nature, to counsel mercy, to represent the people she claimed to serve. This isolation poisoned her decision-making. Political scientists have noted her leadership resembles fascistic authoritarianism, where the leader sees themselves as the sole arbiter of justice and anyone who questions them is an enemy. The toxic triangle of destructive leadership requires a charismatic leader, susceptible followers who don't challenge them, and an environment that enables their worst impulses. By season 8, Daenerys had all three. Her isolation meant no one could stop her from becoming the Mad Queen. Egg experienced the opposite journey. He started alone in a sense, separated from his family, traveling incognito. But with every mile he walked with Duncan, with every person they helped, with every conflict they resolved, he built connections to the real Westeros. And by the time he became king, he had friendships and relationships that grounded him in reality. Duncan became Lord Commander of his Kingsguard and remained his closest friend for 26 years. His queen Betha Blackwood was a love match, not a political arrangement. His brother Maester Aemon chose to go to the wall to prevent anyone from using him against Egg, an act of love and sacrifice. Even Egg's failures were different from Daenerys' failures. When his children defied his arranged marriages, marrying for love instead of political advantage, he was frustrated but accepted it. When Prince Duncan the Small refused to marry Lord Lionel Baratheon's daughter because he loved a common woman named Jenny of Oldstones, Egg eventually gave his blessing rather than forcing the issue. This caused a rebellion and cost him political capital, but it showed Egg valued his children's happiness above dynastic ambition. Can you imagine Daenerys making such a choice? The dragons themselves represent perhaps the ultimate symbol of their opposed journeys. Daenerys was born when dragons had been dead for over a century. She hatched them through fire and blood, walking into Drogo's funeral pyre and emerging with 3 miracles. The dragons were her children, her weapons, and her validation. She raised them from hatchlings, named them for the men she loved, and used them to conquer cities. They made her special, made her unstoppable, made her certain of her destiny. When she lost Viserion beyond the wall, it broke something in her. When Rhaegal died at the hands of Euron Greyjoy's scorpions, it shattered her restraint. By the time only Drogon remained, her relationship with Dragonfire had become purely destructive. She used it not to liberate, but to dominate, not to protect, but to destroy. Egg was born with a dragon egg placed in his cradle, as was Targaryen tradition. It never hatched. He grew up in a world where dragons were legend, where their absence had weakened Targaryen power and made the monarchy dependent on alliances rather than terror. He and his brother Aemon dreamed of hatching dragons and becoming dragon riders like their ancestors. Unlike Daenerys, who achieved this dream, Egg lived his entire life without dragons, and that forced him to rule differently, to build consensus, to negotiate, to compromise. The absence of dragons made him a better king. Only at the end, frustrated by decades of limited progress and noble resistance, did Egg turn to dragons as a solution. He believed that only with dragons could he force the lords to accept his reforms, protecting the small folk. The parallel to Daenerys is striking. Both turned to dragons when their preferred methods failed. Both believed overwhelming force could solve complex political problems. Both died because of that belief. The tragedy at Summerhall killed Egg, Duncan, Prince Duncan the Small, and others. It happened on the same night Rhaegar Targaryen was born, connecting Egg's failure to Daenerys' future through a grim irony. Here's what makes this particularly poignant. Egg's turn to dragons at the end doesn't invalidate his life's work. It shows that even the best Targaryen, the one who walked among small folk and understood their suffering, still carried the family's fatal flaw: the belief that dragons are the answer. Aegon the Fifth spent 26 years trying to change Westeros without dragons, building slowly, compromising reluctantly, accepting limitations. Only his final act betrayed his principles. Daenerys, by contrast, relied on dragons from the moment she had them, and her entire arc is about what happens when dragon fire replaces wisdom. The fundamental difference in their trajectories comes down to this: Egg learned humility through ascent, while Daenerys lost humility through descent. Egg climbed from prince to king, but walked most of that path as a commoner. Daenerys descended from exile to goddess, but never truly understood the people she claimed to serve. She knew slavery was wrong because she had been enslaved, but she never really lived among free small folk, never saw how ordinary people built communities, raised families, and found meaning in simple things. Her entire experience was one of extremes, either powerless victim or all-powerful queen. This is why Egg's nickname, Aegon the Unlikely, carries such weight. He was unlikely not just because he was the fourth son of a fourth son, but because he was unlikely to have the experiences that made him the king he became. What are the odds that a prince would spend his formative years walking the realm with a hedge knight? What are the chances he would see peasant life from the inside rather than the outside? What are the possibilities he would learn that nobility has nothing to do with birth? The universe conspired to create the one Targaryen who truly understood his people, and that understanding defined his reign. Daenerys was also unlikely, but in the opposite way. She was unlikely to survive her childhood, unlikely to escape her brother's abuse, unlikely to hatch dragons, unlikely to conquer cities, unlikely to make it to Westeros. Every step of her journey was improbable. But where Egg's unlikely path taught him humility, Daenerys' unlikely path taught her that she was special, chosen, destined for greatness. She survived impossible odds repeatedly, and that survival convinced her she was right to do whatever was necessary to achieve her goals. The universe kept validating her most extreme choices until suddenly it didn't, and she had no framework for understanding that final failure. Let's consider what each character represents thematically in George R.R. Martin's broader story. Egg represents the hope of reform, the possibility that the system can be changed from within through patience, wisdom, and genuine care for the governed. His story tells us that good intentions matter, that trying to help the small folk is worthwhile even if your reforms don't survive you, and that walking among the people you govern makes you a better ruler. But his story also warns us that even the best intentions can be corrupted by frustration and the seductive promise of power. Summerhall is Martin's reminder that no Targaryen fully escapes the family curse. Daenerys represents the hope and horror of revolution, the promise that broken systems can be smashed and rebuilt, but also the warning that revolutionary violence often devours its children. Her story tells us that those who suffer injustice can become terrible instruments of justice themselves, that power without wisdom leads to catastrophe, and that isolation at the top is a form of madness, where Egg's tragedy is that he tried to change too much too fast at the end. Daenerys' tragedy is that she never learned to change anything slowly. The question HBO's A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms will hopefully explore is this: can we love Egg knowing how his story ends? Can we watch him learn compassion, fight for justice, and build friendships, all while knowing he dies trying to hatch dragons, making the same essential mistake Daenerys makes? The answer is yes, because Egg's 26 years of patient rule matter more than his final, fatal error. The reforms he attempted, even if temporary, showed another way was possible. The small folk he helped remembered him with love. The friendship with Duncan demonstrated that genuine connection can exist between prince and peasant. Compare this to Daenerys. Can we watch her early seasons knowing where she ends up? Can we cheer when she frees the slaves of Astapor knowing she'll eventually burn King's Landing? The tragedy is that Daenerys' early acts of liberation are genuine, She really did free slaves. She really did try to break the wheel. But her methods contained the seeds of her destruction from the beginning. Every time she responded to resistance with fire, every time she chose fear over love, every time she prioritized power over people, she took one more step toward becoming the Mad Queen. The ultimate lesson of Aegon versus Daenerys is that the journey matters more than the destination. Aegon ended badly, but lived well. Daenerys ended badly and increasingly lived badly as her arc progressed. One learned to see people as people through his rise. The other learned to see people as obstacles or followers through her rise. One built institutions and relationships, the other built armies and fear. One accepted the limitations of power, the other refused to accept any limitation. Martin is telling us something profound about power and its corrupting influence. Aegon had every advantage, birth, education, privilege, and still almost succumbed to the Targaryen madness at the end. Daenerys had every disadvantage, abuse, exile, vulnerability, and her climb to power made that madness inevitable. The tragedy isn't that Daenerys went mad like her father. The tragedy is that her journey from slave to master taught her all the wrong lessons about how power should be wielded. As we prepare to watch A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, we should remember that we're seeing the anti-Daenerys. Every choice Aegon makes that brings him closer to the people, every lesson Duncan teaches him about honor and decency, every time he chooses patience over force, he's walking the path Daenerys never found. His story is proof that Targaryens can be different, can be better, can learn to serve rather than rule. But his ending is a reminder that the dragon's blood carries a curse, and even the best of them can fall into fire. Aegon and Daenerys are two sides of the same coin that's been flipping since Aegon the Conqueror first brought dragons to Westeros. One side shows what Targaryens can be at their best, compassionate, humble, dedicated to the people they govern. The other side shows what they become at their worst, isolated, convinced of their destiny, burning the world to save it. Martin has given us both the hope and the horror, the dream and the nightmare, and in doing so, he's crafted the most complete exploration of power and its consequences in modern fantasy. When you watch Aegon's story unfold on HBO, remember you're watching the road Daenerys never took, the choices she never made, the humility she never learned, and mourn for what might have been if only the Mother of Dragons had walked a mile in a hedge knight's footsteps.